Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's lecture. We'll start off with our distinguished speaker. Ms. Naz Shah is a British Labour Party politician. She was elected in 2015 general elections as Member of Parliament for Bradford West, winning the seat from George Galloway of the Respect Party. When elected, she was one of the 9 Muslim Labour MPs. In July 2018, she was appointed to a junior shadow ministerial role as Shadow Minister of State for Women and Equalities, working alongside the Shadow Secretary of State, Dawn Butler. She is also Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims. Before being elected as an MP, Ms. Shah was the chair of the mental health charity Sharing Voices of Bradford, and had previously worked as a carer for disabled people, as an NHS commissioner, and a director for a regional association supporting local councils. Our discussant for today is Ms. Malika Bukhari. Ms. Malika Ali Bukhari is a Pakistani politician who has been member of the National Assembly of Pakistan since August 2018. And she will be speaking on women's rights, human rights violations, and the legal perspective on the topic. I would now like to request Acting President of IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Ali Janjua, to deliver his welcome address.
Thanks, Hamza. Honorable Ms. Naz Shah, Parliamentary Secretary Malika Bukhari, distinguished audience, I extend a very warm welcome to all on this discussion on very important topic of strategic communications with Kashmir as a case study. Today, when I stand here, I'm reminded of a famous quote that I always liked of Che Guevara, the famous Latin revolutionary. He said that whenever death may surprise us, let it be welcome, provided that this, our battle cry, may have reached some receptive ears and some steady hands that should carry forward and be ready to intone the funeral dirge with the staccato singing of machine guns. Now, Kashmir lays prostrate, badly wounded, in chains, and under subjugation. Since 5th of August 2019, a new reign of terror has been let loose upon Kashmir. Its identity has been bilked away. Its civic character has been put under heavy, through machinations. The laws have been changed. There has been a complete assault on human rights and international law. And the BJP, as per their electoral promises, has set about changing the entire character, the demographics, the politics, the ethnography of the whole Jammu and Kashmir state. This is a complete assault, and in the full glare of publicity, the human rights violations and other acts, we all know that the infamous POTA Act of 1987, Public Safety Act of 1978, TADA, these were all a series of acts in a big regime to completely erase the cultural, political, and social identity of Kashmiris. The Reorg Act of 2019 and subsequent Reorg Order 2020 has altered the complete definition of non-subject Kashmiris, enabling 2.5 million non-subject Kashmiris to be settled into Kashmir, with the result that since 2019, there have been 3.8 million non-subject Kashmiris which have been added, altering the entire demographic character of the valley. There have been 15,000 incarcerations, and there have been 391 extrajudicial killings. All this has been documented, and we have got this through reliable sources. We know the whole taxonomy of human right abuses and injustices. This taxonomy starts with human right violations. It goes up to crimes against humanity. It segues into genocide. Now, if you see the whole thing, ultimately, this is attaining the character of war crimes. And why this assault has not been so far challenged through lawfare, I think it has something to do with the international geopolitics, not morality, not international law. As per Genocide Watch, there are 8 stages of genocide, and Kashmiris, they are facing the 6th stage. So there's something very serious, and it's amazing that entire human rights discourse, this thing is given a short shrift compared to other issues of not so significance being given traction on international fora. One of the reasons is the lack of a very strong strategic communication narrative. We know we are living in this age of quantum mechanics. With quantum mechanics and the quantum theory is driving machine learned and artificial intelligence driven strategic communication narratives, wherein instant messaging, instant communications, and a ubiquitous cyberspace in which the messages are bandied about. And the challenge of this age has become to manage the information, not to send the message. But why it is not resonating? Perhaps because of the politics and the international community and United Nations and other organizations have a lot of heavy burden. Why this message has not resonated so far has much to do with the strategic messaging and strategic communication strategies. And we are very fortunate today to have amongst us someone who has exposure to how it feels like out in the outside world, why this message is not resonating there, why the British diaspora or the US diaspora, which have very strong exponents of advocacy about Kashmir, what kind of stonewalling efforts are they facing there? What needs to be done to give this voice of Kashmiris more traction? I think this is the subject of today's discourse. And with this short premise, I would like to give the floor to the discussants and Ms. Nasha to enlighten us on some of these aspects, framing Kashmir as a case study, basic discourses on strategic communications, and how our message could resonate better. So over to you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and thank you, Junju Asad, for that introduction. Assalamu alaikum, friends. Morning to you all. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, especially with my sister Malika Bukhari, because we haven't seen each other for a while. And it's lovely. When we last met, it was when the new government had only recently come in, and Parliament to Parliament, we were meeting all the new MNAs. So it's nice to see how I'd catch up and find out how you've been doing for the last so many years, and how you've embedded into Pakistan politics, and especially with the post-COVID world. The topic at hand is something that is very close to my heart. I spent my teenage years in Azad Kashmir. I'm a daughter of Kashmir, and I speak very often on the issue of Kashmir. And the question today is precisely this: in the pursuit of a Kashmir cause, what is the StratComm's response? And it isn't a discussion on the history of Kashmir, although we've had a really, very, very nice, clear synopsis of what that means. But the room doesn't need reminding about the atrocities of Kashmir. We know that. We know the facts, we know the figures, we know the numbers. And what we do need to, the question is about our response. Can we get this fan switched off at all? Is there any possibility of that? Notwithstanding the grave injustice and done by my home country in Britain, and as they left the region without coming to a solution on the issue of Kashmir, or the failure from the international community and our international institutions like the United Nations, who, whilst passing resolutions, have failed to do any justice as an international arbitrator and witnesses in the matter. The very first realization we must come to and also explain to the world is the gravity of a recent situation, which has developed as a consequence of India's unilateral removal of the special status of Kashmir. The revocation of Article 370 isn't just a law change that the world can have a somber reaction to. The reverberation of this action is precisely a threat to peace in the region. In recent weeks, we have witnessed a stern position from President Biden towards the British government's dangerous tangling over the Good Friday Agreement. To risk the peace is far too serious, and the reality is no one in the West wants to return to a volatile situation in Northern Ireland. Yet, whilst agreements such as the Good Friday Agreement being threatened is a cause for concern for the US and the EU, it is tragic that the world witnessed Kashmir being stripped of its special status, putting two nuclear nations head to head. A people trapped under military occupation, and the world has simply turned a blind eye. The world witnessed the joy of 9th of November in 1989 as the Berlin Wall fell, and people could be united together as a single nation. This pivotal moment in the West was the dream of Kashmiris who believed one day the UN would honour their plebiscite and finally the people of Kashmir would have the opportunity to a referendum and to turn to their dream. However, revocation takes away the long-anticipated hope of the Kashmiris, and whilst it is so important we speak in think tanks like this to highlight policy positions and push communication positions on an international level of Kashmir, and of course, the Prime Minister's speech in Imran Khan's at the United Nations highlighting the plight of the Kashmiri was a historical moment to raise this on a global stage. But it is the grassroots campaigning politics that needs to take centre stage. And as a grassroots campaigning politician, if you ask me the question, what is needed? It is to really change the dark reality of inaction and in silence on the issue of Kashmir. It is to ensure that the Kashmir story is known by the children of Kashmir around the world. And I'm sorry to say the great calamity of Kashmir cause as an activist, on an activist level, exists in the life in little more than the anniversary events. We have anniversary events in Parliament. We have many different groups who turn up, who want the photo ops, who want to put it on Facebook that we have marked this anniversary and that they have spoken for the cause. And it's usually the elderly generation who do this. That's certainly the case in my constituency and in British Parliament. And whilst I recognise and salute many of those, including people who are now known as, Mr. Kashmiris, because of the amount of work they do, and I value what they do, the truth is that we haven't got to the younger people. We have an abundance of young Kashmiris and Pakistani diaspora communities, particularly in Bradford West. We have one of the largest diaspora communities in the UK. Ask them about the issue of Kashmir, and they will only be able to tell you the very basics. Ask them about the issue of Palestine, and then they are at the forefront of organising demonstrations around the world because the reality is they feel more connected to the Palestinian cause than the issue of Kashmir. Whilst there are many key factors for this, what is undeniable is the impact on the Palestinian movement is this. 2008, the attacks on Gaza lasted 3 weeks. In summer of 2014, they lasted 7 weeks. And in 2021, they lasted 11 days. This is purely because of international pressure applied directly as a result of social media revolutions. It was noted at the time that the soft image that Israel attempted to portray to the world was left unmasked. Campaigners on social media and protesters around the world helped do that. Israel completely misjudged the power of social media, especially as celebrities such as Bella and Gigi Hadid, Rihanna, Trevor Noah, and Zayn Malik weighed into the conversation. Viral videos exposing the true reality in Gaza allowed the world to make its own judgment on the devastating war on the people of Gaza. So geopolitics, whilst I absolutely take the point that Brigadier Jinjua made about the geopolitics, the truth is the world has changed and we need to move with it. When turning back to the Kashmir cause, so bringing it back home, we must learn from the messaging on Palestine. I'm not saying it will be an overnight change, but what we need to do is to make a start. And that start firstly by providing access to information on Kashmir. So, for example, I spoke at the Jinnah University, Fatima Jinnah University yesterday, and whilst we were researching the story of Pakistan, there is not one documentary about Quaid-e-Azam out there. If we want to understand the cause of the issue of Kashmir, surely we have to understand the issue of how Pakistan came into existence. We have to tell our young people, and the documentaries, the documents and the books that are out there, do they do justice to the issue of how Pakistan was created, how this conflict started, and what happened since? And the answer is, it's not out there. So whilst we put all these energies into, and I'm not saying we don't need the army, of course we need the army. I'm not saying we don't need infrastructure support, but our biggest, when I look at Pakistan, I see one of the biggest things that we put our cost into is the defense, is those line of control, is having those conversations. I was here during the Pulwama attack, and at the Pulwama attack, I was very, very impressed with your Prime Minister at the time, who returned an Indian soldier. And, Modi at the time was literally, warmongering with his election campaign. So the conversation has to move away from Pakistan responding to India and Pakistan carving its own narrative for the Kashmiris without Pakistan, being at the center of that. Does that make sense? It has to be done, and we have to see that strategic shift. We need information on Kashmir, and the current situation needs to be explained in ways that can be accessed by people. So, we're all on Twitter. We all have now this videos. We all have, global change videos. We have lots of mediums. How much are we actually exploiting it? If we look back just at those 11 days on Gaza, just those 11 days, we can learn a lot. We really, really can. We won't just engage with Kashmiri young people, we'll engage with the rest of the world. Because the issue of Kashmir isn't just for people of Kashmir. It isn't just for us in Pakistan. It isn't just for us in Great Britain because we have a connection to Kashmir. You just like you don't have to understand, you don't have to understand what's going on in the geopolitical arena in Palestine. You just need to be human to see the atrocities. And that's the very basics that we need to come down to. So whilst we're here at an institute where as academics, we are sat here talking about all these things, the truth is, what is our messaging? If we look at messaging, even if we look at Brexit, even if we look at, the last election that Boris Johnson won in the UK, what was his messaging? It was really, really simple. It was get Brexit done. That was it. Get Brexit done. He did Brexit. That's another political conversation about where that ended up. We've got a fuel crisis. We've had to bring the army in. But that, park that to the side, it won him an election, because these are the kind of messaging, those short, sharp messaging that need to be delivered to people beyond the people who have got open doors. Because the world you're pushing against an open door when you're talking. When I'm talking to you, I'm pushing against an open door because you all get it. That's why you're here. But actually, what are the young people in England, in Germany, in France, in Western countries, what are they seeing? Do we have the TikTok viral videos? Do we have the Insta viral videos? And do we have characters who are not just of Kashmiri heritage who are talking about it? Like we do have celebrities from other communities who are talking about the issues. You've got people in Hollywood. Hollywood is divided over the issue of Palestine and Israel. We all see that. Why aren't the same divisions in Hollywood and other places about Kashmir? We need to ask those questions. And I sometimes think we can't see the wood for the trees, and we complicate it with, yes, it's a political geopolitics, but ultimately Israel misjudged it. And I think we're in a dangerous place where we're misjudging that intervention. We have to take a critical look at ourselves. Climate change, Black Lives Matter, all of these are examples of what successful media campaigns look like. Greta Thunberg was a child when she started this. She has got children. We have had in London being brought to a standstill with climate change. We have had every school in the country participating in Climate Change Week, which is led by a child who's not even in Great Britain. That is the power of social media. That is the power of people. So the power dynamics has shifted. Let's get with that narrative rather than doing what we normally do. If we use the same tools, we continue to build the same building. So we have to change our tools and our approach. We're talking about Genocide Watch. For me, as a parliamentarian, I spoke in the Kashmir debate, which happened 2 weeks ago. I spoke in the one that happened on the 13th of January in Parliament, and I spoke in the one on the floor of the House now twice, one that happened in 2019. The Genocide Watch is an interesting one because when we look at what's happened in Palestine, there are different Human Rights Watch and others have made very, very academic research which suggests that Israel is applying apartheid policies. We have Genocide Watch, which is, and rightfully said, where is Kashmir on that path towards genocide? They have said very clearly, because it's military zone, it is ripe for genocide. What's happening in Kashmir? It is the most militarized zone in the world, in that region. So it's not. We have to use those academic things to underpin the narrative, because you've got the evidence there. You've got the evidence. This isn't, the idea that this is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. What it is something that should keep us up at night, because you've got two nuclear powers which have a conflict. That should keep us all up at night across the globe. What isn't being said is that research that we need to hammer home. Whether it's when it's talking about Israel and Palestine, it's the issue of apartheid, because that rings true, doesn't it? It rings true when we had South Africa. People used boycotts, people used sanctions. There are many different views on the issue of using sanctions against Israel, but many people are using them. Many people are using things. So we need to take lessons, and we need to learn them. We need to do them quick, because what I don't want to do, and I've said this for the last 6.5 years, is every time I attend a meeting on Kashmir, and with late Gerald Kaufman, who used to, I remember attending a meeting with him, and I said, I really don't want to be attending these meetings in 5 or 6 years' time. It's great to meet you all, and it's brilliant to be in Pakistan addressing this issue, but it's in sadness. It's tragic that I'm having to do this. It's tragic that anybody is having to talk about these conflicts. So I don't do it with happiness and joy. I do it with genuine sadness, because this isn't something that we should be talking about. This situation of the girls being raped, of the mothers who lose their sons, of no justice for the Kashmiris, of that landscape being changed by an influx of people who don't have that historical attachment, the status being changed, but all of that is that, for me, it's really, really sad. And when there's a comparison, and people like in Great Britain in the debate this last couple of weeks ago was very much about pro-Indian MPs concentrating on Pakistan and its issue around terrorism. And it's got nothing to do with it. It's a very, very different, the debate that happened in Parliament, I feel it shouldn't have gone down that conversation. But it did, because people make their points. And what India does well is use them and puts it out there. In comparison, do we have the same efforts? And I'm not just talking about in Pakistan. Do we have the same efforts to infiltrate the mind, young people, people to understand the atrocities what are happening? I said at the time, and I'll say again, until every daughter in Kashmir is free of a threat of rape, until every mother in Kashmir is reunited with her sons, until every child can go about their business daily without the threat of pellet guns and being blinded, which takes away 70% of their ability, I certainly will not stop speaking about the issue of Kashmir. But I don't want that to be my reality. And if I don't want that to be my reality as a parliamentarian who's lived in Azad Kashmir, who had the luxury of being able to go to school, who had the luxury of going shopping, not with a barrel down the back of my neck, not having to worry whether the boys were going to come home that night, the question for us is, what are we doing about it? Too many lives have been lost. But the StratComm response has to be at grassroots, because that's where campaigning matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Shah. I'm sure these enlightening comments can act as major takeaways for our policymakers when devising strategies here in Pakistan. Now, I'd like to request Ms. Malika Bukhari to share her comments.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hussain and Brigadier Janjua for inviting me to speak here. Naz, welcome to Pakistan. It's always lovely to have you here. Can I just begin by thanking you for your leadership and commitment on this very important issue pertaining to innocent Kashmiris. I think you've always been a very brave voice. I watched your speech in Parliament. I follow your work, and it's extremely inspiring to see a female parliamentarian speak about issues that are of critical importance. I think you have an important role to play as a member of parliament in Britain, and you play that role extremely well. And I always see members of the UK Parliament, especially in the all political party group on Kashmir, as being a voice for the voiceless Kashmiris. I think that is very commendable. And they always speak about Kashmiris as being innocent victims of a conflict, a very long conflict, in one of the most heavily militarized zones in the world, which is, I think, akin to an open-air prisons. So thank you very much for doing that. And thank you very much for very eloquently explaining what Pakistan's StratComm strategy should be to the Kashmir issue. I think you very pertinently, very importantly laid down how different campaigns across the globe have been influenced, how people have galvanized opinion, how narrative has been set on important issues because of different StratComm strategies. And I think we should be carrying out introspection as a country and looking at examples across the globe and examples that the Honorable Parliamentarian has cited to raise the gross human rights violations being committed in Kashmir. As a legislator and as a female parliamentarian, I always begin with talking about the women of Kashmir, our sisters in Kashmir, who have, I think, been the greatest victims of this unresolved conflict. Whether it is the half widows of Kashmir who don't know whether their husbands are ever going to come back, or whether they are the victims of Kunan, Pushpara, or the Kotha victim. Women are subjected to unparalleled forms of sexual violence and rape in illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Rape is used as a form of collective punishment to humiliate the people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And sadly, I believe the world just stands by and watches these atrocities being committed on the innocent women of Kashmir. There are examples under international law where this collected form of punishment has been declared illegal, as it should be. India is party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It breaches that. The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination lays down how such illegal acts cannot occur in an occupied territory. Despite all of that, it continues. The government of Pakistan has presented a 131-page complete dossier, a complete document. Naz, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that, but it's a very important dossier, and I wish I had a copy of it to present it to you, but maybe you can. You have it live over there. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. IPRI is always very well prepared. Thank you, Dr. Hussain, for that. But it's a 131-page complete dossier, a document that contains reports of 32 human rights watchdogs and 14 reports by Pakistan on the Indian forces' human rights violations in the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. I know the numbers are out there, but just to reiterate that, the dossier covers accounts of 3,432 cases of war crimes, in which 1,178 troops have been found to be involved, including 1 major general, 4 inspectors, inspector generals, 7 deputy inspector generals, 5 brigadiers, 31 colonels, and 188 majors and captains in human rights violations, which have now, I think, reached epic proportions in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Since 1989, and these figures are staggering. Now spoke about Palestine, as an example, as a conflict that has come to the world stage. But the figures in Kashmir, Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, are staggering. 96,000 extrajudicial killings, 162,000 cases of arbitrary arrest and torture, over 25,000 pellet gun injuries were recorded, 11,250 women were raped. I think we should let that sink in. There were this huge number of innocent women that were raped as a collective form of punishment by an occupying force in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. 23,000 widowed women and over 108,000 children who were orphaned. This document also provides details of 8,652 unmarked mass graves that have been identified in 89 villages of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So we have come out with this huge dossier that documents the gravity of the violations of international human rights law, of treaties and conventions, of instances of abuses committed at the hands of the occupying force. And now we want the world to support the Kashmiris. It is not just about Kashmir being, an unresolved conflict under the auspices of the UN Security Council resolutions. What has happened since that unresolved conflict and what has happened since the illegal annexation of 5th August is something that needs to be talked about more, something that needs corrective action, something that needs the international community and partners to stand up to. The ministers who addressed the press conference and presented the dossier spoke about how we expect the United Nations to compel the government of India to allow free access to special procedure mandate holders of the UN Human Rights Council for independent investigation. That is exactly what we require. We require independent investigations into the human rights violations occurring in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, especially post the illegal unilateral annexation of 5th August. I know Naz spoke in her speech at the All Parliamentary Party Group about Magnitsky-style sanctions. I think that is an important area. There are countries like the United Kingdom, which stand up for human rights, which have one of the finest legal systems in the world. I trained as a barrister in Britain, and I was exposed to one of the finest legal minds. I was exposed to great academics, human rights activists, lawyers who stood up for violations of human rights. And the UK has a domestic legal regime that allows sanctioning individuals who've committed these gross violations against innocent people. And I think this is a fit case for implementation of the UK global human rights sanctions regime on perpetrators of state-sponsored war crimes. Of course, there is a huge legal context to the Kashmir issue. Beyond the United Nations Security Council resolutions, as I explained earlier, the human rights violations being undertaken are a breach of, you can find a breach of every single human rights treaty or convention on the United Nations statute book, if you look at Kashmir as an example. And that is something that, of course, requires to be explored more and requires urgent action. When we speak about the illegal annexation, firstly, of Jammu and Kashmir, we don't talk about it much, but international law does not recognize such illegal annexation. And according to the international precedent, there's a duty upon states not to recognize such unlawful annexations. And that, of course, applies to Kashmir as well. Under Article 49 of the Geneva Convention 4, the occupier is prohibited to transfer civilians into an occupied territory. And that is happening as we speak. The 5th August unilateral illegal annexation is an example of how the transfer of civilians and demographic changes that are taking place are a breach of the Geneva Convention 4. We now spoke about pellet guns, and pellet guns became a huge issue and were brought to international media limelight a couple of years ago. Do you remember that campaign that was led? And that exposed the gravity of the crime, the gravity of the human rights violation, the number of people that sustained eye injuries and how it impacted their lives once they sustained these eye injuries. And they are now known as dead eye epidemics. About more than 3,000 people in the region have sustained eye injuries because of these pellet guns. And of course, the indiscriminate use of these pellet guns is against all laws of war. I think that's established, and India needs to be held to account for that. Specifically, this indiscriminate use of pellet guns is a violation of India's obligations under Article 146 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And the United Nations and the international community must hold India to account for this gross violation as well. I spoke earlier about the issue of rape as a form of collective punishment against the innocent women of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and how international law has classified that the rapes committed during search operations are not merely classified as domestic crimes, but are considered a war crime. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia has held in its decision in Bahrain that rapes committed during weapon searches by combatants and members of forces are in the context of an armed conflict and so are war crimes. So we now have a precedent at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia that war crimes are undertaken every time a Kashmiri woman or girl is raped in the process of a search operation, or whether they're raped as a form of collective punishment. And that is something that urgently requires to be dealt with. Rape is a domestic crime, but when occurred in this context as a heinous offense, it's a war crime. And of course, war crimes cannot be operated with complete impunity. I also know that there are a number of opinions, international opinions, such as the opinion in the Wall case, which also talks about how it is a violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And I can, as a lawyer, go on very long about the grave nature of international law obligations that continue to take place in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir as a result of the atrocities being committed by the occupying force. But I think I would like to sum it up by saying that, as Nas said, the first step for us Pakistanis here in Pakistan, for whom Kashmir it's intrinsic to a foreign policy and it's intrinsic to Pakistan's existence. We should look at what StratComm options we can undertake as a country. But I would also like to state here that Pakistan has undertaken a whole of government approach. We have consulted within ourselves between different government departments, and Pakistan is ready to exercise all lawfare options that are available in order to hold India to account. Of course, I cannot delineate those lawfare options in this very public seminar, but Pakistan is ready to and well prepared to undertake all those lawfare options after undertaking the whole of government approach and consultation with a number of legal experts, researchers in government departments. And all the instances of human rights violations that I cited in my discussion, I think require urgent intervention by the United Nations, by the international community, and by those who stand for human rights, irrespective of their political affiliation or irrespective of their national identity. I think Kashmir is not an issue. It's a human rights issue. It's not an issue that is linked to a particular identity. And the British parliamentarians in the all-parliamentary group have proved that they can stand up for breaches of human rights violations wherever they occur, because human rights violations are universal in nature. They're never confined to a particular territory, and if they're occurring anywhere in the world, parliamentarians especially, as voices of people, as guardians of democracy, as elected representatives, should always speak up against these. And as a Pakistani member of parliament, I will continue to do that. And I will utilize everything I've learned in Britain to that effect. Thank you very much, Naz, for being here. Thank you, Brigadier Saab, for inviting me. And thank you, Dr. Saab, for having me speak here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bukhari, for your comments. Before I call upon the Executive Director of Communications and Outreach here at IPRI, I would just like to mention that IPRI has been collaborating with Pakistan's digital media wing to design StratComm trainings for state institutions to, enhance capacity in data analytics, digital, and StratComm itself. So that would actually be an extremely important step towards digitizing the entire narrative as well. Dr. Hussain Nadeem.
Thank you, Hamza, and Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Honorable members of the parliamentarians, Naz Shah and Malika Bukhari, welcome to IPRI. It was such a pleasure to hear you, and respected Brigadier Rashid Ali Janjua. I have some very interesting comments to make on very interesting conversations. Thank you, Naz. You mentioned some very, very important points, which are music to my ear, because I think that's the type of conversations we are not having here in Pakistan on the Kashmir issue. So somebody from the outside, I think it's just very, very powerful. You said three very important things, and I want to respond to each one of them. You said that if you use the same tools, you will continue to make the same building. Absolutely spot on. Absolutely. I think there is nothing more important than this specific line on using the same tool, because I believe that specifically on the Kashmir issue, we're trying to fight Kashmir issue through press release in this day and age. Our core response is press release. And this is for the very first time that at least the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have come up with a data-backed dossier, which is still very new. But again, a lot of times there was more reliance on the press release. So can we really fight Kashmir cause with a press release? Unbelievable. We're still using billboards, by the way. During around February 5 time, you come to the Constitution Avenue, you'll see billboards. I don't know who they are for. The real problem is if you're trying to fight a Kashmir cause using StratComm, we don't know our audience. Who's the audience? So let me elucidate a little bit about who the audience is. And I'll come back on that a little bit after that. But you mentioned another point, which is something very touching, because I spent 3 years at Oxford and Cambridge doing my studies over there. British expats don't know beyond the basics. Let me tell you, the Pakistani youth doesn't know beyond the basics either, living here. Now, this is one of the big problems, because when I'm hiring for this role or any government roles from good universities, top schools, you talk about the national priorities or the national security issues, you will not find Kashmir as a top cause. The reason is because for the last 20 years, the generation I belong to, I was born in 87. So we saw 9/11 happen as very young. So since then, terrorism and counterterrorism became the premier issue. So we lost Kashmir. So you talk to any Pakistani young kid right now, why do we fight for Kashmir? They really don't know. So that's one second problem. Can we bring back the intellectual discourse and the justifications and the reason why that is so important? Because beyond the press release and the semantics of rights for Kashmir, nobody really knows why we are doing what we are doing. So this is one very important issue. The third is, you talked about one very important point again. It was that StratComm has to be local and domestic and organic. The TikTok videos. How do we make Kashmir sexy again? So the whole difference, because I was living in the US and UK and then recently in Australia, the core difference between Palestine, the way I saw it, and the Kashmir was Palestine issue had become it had become a symbol of resistance. And just the kafaya, wearing the kafaya itself became where is that symbol over here? So for the Marxists, it was in South America, it was the Marxist cap. In Palestine, it was the kafaya. In Kashmir, I don't know. So how have we not been able to evolve and reform the StratComm around it and the other issues that can actually talk Kashmir cause to the young audience? The reason why I say is that is the numbers. The data is very much there. We have 65% of Pakistan right now under the age of 30. But if you're going to have billboards on the Constitution Avenue of Kashmir cause with middle-aged men with beards, how do you connect them with them? and 50% men are women in Pakistan. How do you connect the women with those? I'm sorry, I'm not saying it in a negative way, but how do you connect those 50% women with middle-aged or old-age men that are on the billboards? These are some very, very basic things. So for the StratComm, we first need to identify our audience. And audience is both local, like you said. The more important is the local. If we fix the local side, the global is easy. So I'm very glad that Malika is here, because Malika is very actively working on these issues. And I've, in very short time, developed very fondness for her, because she's a voice of reason, because she understands a lot of things. So in the meetings, I can understand that there is some representation of the women, of the younger audience as well, because of things that are there, because the systems are still evolving. So the dossier was there, and when the dossier was finalized by Dr. Mohit Yusuf and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I asked, and the IPRI then took the lead on that, to actually not just have dossiers in the printed copy, because how many really can you sell, or how many can you distribute? 1,000, maybe, or 500? So what we did was something very interesting, which I want to just display. We took all the data and we collected more data, and we essentially transformed that into a dashboard, because the dashboard can be used digitally by kids from the age of 14 upwards towards, and it can be more global. So we've gotten a lot of hits for this. And it's not just that what we've done. What we've done with this dashboard is we've plugged in all the data that was there, and we did a comparative study with the Bosnia, with Yugoslavia, to show the people why Kashmir is an important issue. So Bosnia, for instance, was 3 months, or Rwanda was 3 months, and it had 1 million or 700 deaths. Kashmir is going for 70 years, and it's a slow genocide in many ways. So what happens is that something triggers short term, for instance, missile attacks in Tel Aviv, and it blows up. With the Kashmir, what the real issue is that it's done at an intensity which does not really raise an alarm bell globally, but it keeps the issue very much embedded. So it's neither there or here. It's at the place where it will not come on the surface, but it will be living underneath the skin, which becomes more problematic. And at times, I think it's very important, because the numbers and the data speaks itself. So one of the things that we've been doing and we've been trying to do is, one, this dashboard, through which dashboard we've done the data and also the narrative. So we've gone back into the Kashmir history. If you can please show the timeline of events. So we've done the whole dashboard on this. If you can move forward, starting from the very, very start, the Shami dynasty, for the people to actually know how Kashmir landed where it is, and whether the atrocities are anything new. A lot of people don't realize that pre-partition, the things that happened over there during the Dogra rule are still very much there. So that is how the issue has evolved over the time period. So we've done that throughout the years, how Kashmir has evolved under the different rules, and how the Dogra rule to the Sikh rule has really brought us to a place where we are right now. If you can also show the timeline of genocides. So we've done this for the purpose of that, and then demonstrating exact events on when and what happened. So the Shawi will attack, and the brutal Dogras, all the period, and with the data on how much happened during those times. So this is for the purpose of basically digitalizing our efforts in the Kashmir. And now on this one part, there are 3 things that I think very, very important that I wanted to talk about. Is we've been talking about Kashmir issue from the narrative of victimhood. There is only insofar that the world will take the victimhood, because nobody wants to see dead children. The international audience certainly does not want to see that, because they want to ignore that conveniently. So how do we change our strategy to show some of this and some of the other stuff? What is the other stuff? That is something that we have to figure out in the time being. One other issue is that we've religiositized the Kashmir issue too much. Can we make it about the people, not the religion? That's one very important point, because then we will have a larger audience. So in hopes to have the audience, because for a very long time, since 1947, because our audience was Muslim solidarity, we need to really reevaluate if that is still working or not. So, or do we need to probably de-link that from a particular religious connotations to a more political and human rights connotation, where the data is abundant. So that's one very important point. The last thing I think is very important is using data for human rights. We have to fight through data. We can't fight fake news with fake news. We have to fight it through data. We can't fight violence with violence. We have to fight it through data. And I think that you're spot on this point, that data, technology, new tools That's the only way forward. But speaking the language of the people is even more important. So if it's women rights, we have to speak the language. If it's the Kashmir rights, we really need to speak to the language of the audience that is there. So I think that's something that's very important. I'm just going to end it on this point, and I think that's very useful, that why do we even talk about Kashmir? And for instance, why were we even talking about Afghan people for the last 20 years? There is a reason why I do that, is because of the own different statement of, from 2006 report, and then the US National Security Strategy of 2001, that you cannot have one country that is unstable and poverty, which will not affect the rest of the world. In Pakistan, you look at the geography, you have one place with 70 years long Kashmir issue going on, millions of people under house arrest and all the violence. And then you have on the other side is Afghanistan. How can Pakistan possibly prosper? And you very rightly mentioned about the securitization and the defense and all. Unfortunately, our geography and all those that have happened, our history, we're prison to that. So, but the onus is on us. The onus is really on us. So the StratComm strategy has to be evolved in a way where we're able to essentially talk the language and then essentially be able to sell this message to the international community. 9/11 happened because of the ungoverned spaces, about the politics that went on for a long. Kashmir is also a melting pot. You will have problems. It will continue to destabilize. There's only insofar people will take the violence. So the international pressure is not there the same way it is for Palestine, because Palestine has become a symbol of resistance. So for us is, how do we actually start changing it and knowing our audience to make it a symbol? And thank you so much again for this conversation, because I think just sitting over here was such a treat to listen to you. Always a pleasure to listen to Malika as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeem. Now, before I open the session for the question and answers, I would just like to mention that we've had an online question for people who've actually been following this on YouTube, and any of the panelists can answer this. Is there a way for Pakistan to solve the Kashmir issue which is feasible and in favor of the Kashmiri people? Then he or she goes on by saying that so far we've only seen them suffer. Military action is ineffective. What else can be done to solve it in favor of Kashmiris? And will we see it happen soon?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very pertinent question, and something that crosses the minds of everyone who's concerned about this unresolved conflict. Clearly, I think the beginning point would be the implementation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions, granting the people of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir the right to self-determination under the auspices of the India-Pakistan question, as promised and guaranteed by the United Nations. Implementation of those UNSC resolutions would be the first point. But under the United Nations, as a body, I think Human Rights Council, there are many avenues for holding India to account for its gross violations of human rights obligations. I cited the International War Crime Tribunal Yugoslavia, how that has sanctioned the rape of women in occupied territory as a war crime. The UN Human Rights Council is an effective body that can raise this issue effectively. And, there are various treaties and conventions under the auspices of the United Nations, including, the Rome Treaty, the Genocide Act, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights that India is party to. So there's ample legal statutes available, international statutes available to hold India to account. We just require will from nations. We require will from the United Nations, and we just need the world to wake up to what's happening in Kashmir for this to be resolved. And of course, a military solution is never an option between two nuclear armed states.
As you mentioned during your discourse, the young generation in UK is very environmentally aware, and the climate related or any matter that concerns them regarding environmental degradation could be embedded in that Kashmir's advocacy. We know that there's a militarization of glaciers, and the owl ecosystem is being disturbed. deforestation because of the large military presence. Could you enlighten us a little bit more on this issue? That what are the key messages that by way of this environmental degradation need to be sent so that it resonates with the young generation there?
Thank you for that. So there's two things, isn't there? There's one about the question from Brigadier Janjua, and there's one which was from your audience. In terms of your audience, I think we've covered that in the speeches that everybody's given. Coming back to the environmental, I mean, it's never been framed, and to be fair, it's not something I've thought about, and I've just looked over at my team thinking this is something that we need to go away with, because I've never, and it's a really interesting point, because my takeaway from here will be actually from what is the environmental, is there a way of framing this into a discussion of climate change? Because I know I was at a gathering in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and we had the United Nations represent there. And what we talked about is the next issue for the globe isn't, it isn't nuclear, it's about water. It's about water deprivation. That is what's going to cause the next wars, or that's going to be the next. The commodity isn't necessarily gas and oil. It's about whether, and Pakistan is at threat. I know I'm familiar with the Pakistan's positioning or threat and conversations around water, but I'm not particularly with occupied Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir. So I'm happy to go away and talk about them. And I think it's something that we will now go away and research. And if there's anything that the Institute has done on that, I'd be very welcome of it.
So we'll now open the floor for question and answers. Please introduce yourselves and raise your hands prior to asking a question. Yes, please. Mike. Sorry.
I'm Shabir Ahmed from BTV World, and my question is with Ms. Naz. As you rightly pointed out that there is a lot of vacuum, especially vis-a-vis Gaza issue is concerned and Kashmir issue is concerned, that we have saw less use of social media, especially in the larger Western audience, and especially the audience belonging to, which are concerned with the like this issue of Kashmir. So what do you think that what exact role diaspora over there in Western countries can play, especially in this? Because if there are material is available, we have seen a lot of material coming from occupied territory vis-a-vis human rights violations are concerned, also other atrocities are concerned. So that need to reach out to a larger audience. But someone from Pakistan, if even they use Twitter or Insta or other platforms, that may not be more much effective as much as someone sitting in like Western countries. They know the audience and they have in their followers, they have more audience which has meaning, which can have a meaningful impact, which we have seen, because I covered Gaza conflict in 2014 with Al Jazeera, and we have seen that the impact of Western journalists' tweets and their narrative was more than the journalists which were directly related to the conflict. So what role exactly the diaspora in Western countries can play, especially to raise this issue on social media, and like MPs like you and other influential persons, and how they can be engaged by Pakistan, especially to promote the narrative through social media, which can reach to the particular people, which matters a lot.
Thank you for your question, Shabir. So there's a few things. In addition to what I've talked about here about what the StratComm's response needs to be, the truth is that needs to then translate into the diaspora community. And one of my biggest worries, and one of my, as much as I love seeing all these people because they're amazing constituents, everything, it is that middle-aged or older male Pakistani heritage who knows the issue of Kashmir. And I really valued Dr. Hussein's comments, because I'd never contextualized it as post 9/11 young people are in that framing of terrorism in the world, as opposed to Kashmir. So we've lost some of that. And I say this all the